Next, I want to introduce a man who has a huge portfolio under his direction. David Bunn was appointed as Director of the Department of Conservation on June 18th, 2015. Prior to his appointment, he was Associate Director of the International Program Office of the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences at the University of California at Davis. Previously, he served as Deputy Director of Legislation for the Department of Fish and Game, now Department of Fish and Wildlife, and was Principal Consultant and Legislative Director in the Office of California State Assembly Member Fred Keeley. He was Associate Consultant for the California State Senate Natural Resources and Wildlife Committee, and later he directed the development of California's Wildlife Action Plan. He's a project director and researcher at One Health Institute at the School of Veterinary Medicine, where his work included directing international research projects. He was the environmental program director at the California Public Interest Research Group, and he worked at the California Agrarian Action Project in the 1980s. He was the second director. I was the first director. David earned a Ph.D. in conservation ecology. He has a master's in science and international agricultural development and a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Biology from the University of California. And he will be speaking about the stewardship of California's natural resources with a view towards the next 100 years. David Bunn.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. I spent the weekend rejuvenating in the Sierra. I'm a little sore, but you know, when you go up there and you see all the water and you see how it's rejuvenating life, it's just wonderful to see. My son works in Yosemite Valley, and he's called me and says, basically, water's coming out of just about every part of the wall you've never seen water come from, and life is abundant. I have been given this kind of broad topic of talking about stewardship of California's resources for the next 100 years. And this is probably my favorite topic. I think it was ordained that I was going to work in natural resources. I went to John Muir High School. But before I start, I should basically mention the Department of Conservation. We do many things that actually are relevant to not only the Sierra resources, but resources all over the state. But with regard to the Sierra and the Southern Cascades, you know, we basically we're the only state in the nation where counties regulate mining, but we basically back the counties up and provide an oversight role in working with them and implementing mining reclamation, as you'll hear more about later. We're involved in watershed and agricultural and rangeland conservation through easements and other projects. We do a very specific function. We regard forestry as we do the slide analyses from the Office of the California Geological Survey, one of our divisions. We do the slide analyses when they propose a timber harvest. We try to determine, well, will that cause a slide or not? And after there's a fire, we do the post-fire slide analyses, determine where will the debris flows go, and we give that information to local governments to figure out how to prepare for the next winter. Another resource issue, and there's many others that our department's involved in, but another one is geothermal. And basically, for example, at Mammoth and other places along the Sierra Cascade, we're the ones who basically provide oversight and management of geothermal energy. And there is no better place to work on natural resources, frankly, than California. I think those who have heard me talk many times, I probably sound like a broken record, but I always talk about we are the natural resource state. I was involved in, I led writing the state wildlife plan, the first one, and I think after writing that, I think somewhere in the first paragraph, I wrote, we are the wildlife state. Because if you think about it, far and away the most biodiverse state in the nation, and if you look at almost every other natural resource category, we're very near the top in the nation, and for good reason. Start with our geology, our topography, where we're located on the coast, on and on and on. If you can travel the state, you're going to see such a diverse state with incredible natural resources. So of course, it's very important that we manage them. But meanwhile, we also have 40 million people, and probably the vast majority of those folks don't get the pleasure of actually going out and recreating or spending time with, or frankly even have much background, more so than ever, because most people are urban, and the opportunities are limited. And therefore, there's this big challenge, and I'm going to come back to that a little later, but a very big challenge for us to manage natural resources in the future is basically how we reach out to those 40 million people. But first, I should talk about the past 100 years, just briefly. So where we are now is based on what I would say, in terms of problems we've caused from past actions, is basically those actions were due to management decisions, or the lack of management, or the lack of scientific understanding. We were making decisions we thought were good decisions, but we really didn't know. Or the lack of planning, just kind of just let it go. You know, a lot of people are kind of, you know, planning can be controversial. It sometimes seems like too much of government, but if you just let it happen, it's usually not, you usually lose resources unnecessarily when you could have a very high quality of life, but also preserve your natural resources. So, because almost all of these things that, you know, the impacts that we've had, my thesis really is that through good management decisions, through good science, and through good planning and actions, we actually can take care and provide good stewardship for the next 100 years. Those past actions, and I'll refer primarily to Sierra Nevada and Cascades, but they caused problems like hydraulic mining impacts, chemical mining, mining with chemicals, 100 years of fire suppression. We thought that was a good thing 100 years ago. 150 years of excessive grazing, and that's been changing for decades now, but if you go back particularly the late 1800s and then well into the next 100 years, in many parts, particularly in the high mountain meadows, areas that couldn't really sustain the kinds of numbers of animals that were put on these areas. And of course, these aren't all negative things, but they have their impacts. But again, if you look at the dams and the water diversions, we've essentially, as all this audience knows, have pretty much dammed and diverted just about every water course in the entire state one or more multiple times. And so that has a major impact on the resources. And of course, we need to do that in cases, but the impacts are large. And then more generically, at a global level, we have climate change, as you just heard a lot about, and I'm not going to talk about it, but that global activity that we've made decisions to do certain things have generated greenhouse gases and then, of course, had more local impacts. So these past decisions basically have led us down various paths, and I think going forward, you know, we can make the decisions as we already are. In the last several decades, we've started to shift decisions, and very often what we're doing now is actually restoring impacts that we ourselves caused in the past, because now we understand the science and we understand the ramifications of what we're doing. So good stewardship for the next 100 years requires the following. One, applying the better science that we already know and are learning. And more technically sound information, building the social, political structures in our communities to adaptively manage change and to accommodate the range of political and cultural views. If you drive up Highway 395, you hear two radio stations as you pass by Mammoth. One is, and they're polar opposite of the political perspective. One station is pretty much for the people who have lived in the region for decades or ranched or done other activities. It really appeals to the audience. And the other one is basically the people who come up to Mammoth to go skiing or the outdoors or backpack, and almost more of an urban audience, or frankly, the more recent immigrants into the area. And so that cultural divide is actually, many of you that do live in this area, you know that exists in most rural areas of this state and other states. And that is what we need to constantly working on bridging, is bringing those diverse interests, those diverse activities, and frankly, those diverse political views together. So how do we do this? We have to build, facilitate, and support organizations that create social political structure, basically grassroots organizations that are embedded in communities, but also are connected to statewide networks. We can do this through groups like the Sierra Alliance, like the Sierra Institute, like the RCDs, the Conservancies, the Sierra Fund, and many other hundreds of community groups that are up and down the state, as they do already. And we need to further develop diverse organizations that basically are welcoming to the diverse opinions that live in the Sierra and the Cascades and throughout the state. That's number one. Number two is we really need to step up, and we're doing this, but really make a high priority throughout all these efforts to educate our youth. So, as I mentioned, we have 40 million people, and if you grow up in the state and you have no relationship to the outdoors, you have no relationship to the Sierra, when it comes to policy and priorities and allocation, the natural resources are going to lose. Years ago, this is probably 15 years ago, we had the conversation where state parks basically got rid of Olivera Street as one of their parks in downtown LA and turned it over to the county. Well, that was the last park, urban park, the state had at the time. And so when you go to try and raise money for state parks, people say, well, most people, they don't even get out to state parks. Why should we give them money? We should just give money to local parks. That same idea is relevant to all of our other areas of natural resources. Agriculture, whether you care about endangered species or you care about agriculture, if people don't have a relationship to it, they're not going to relate to it in a rational way. They're not going to have a rational conversation, and so on. It doesn't matter what natural resource. We actually have a similar problem, regardless of what the natural resource is. And that is, we have, for the most part, a population that doesn't have much of a relationship to it, and as a result, their political leaders don't have much of a relationship to it. So when you bring these issues before them, basically you're starting from scratch. And it's hard to get the right decisions made when people don't have that in their background. So now I think that begins with starting with educating youth, so it basically comes up. The other is increasing how we share science and information to create a more informed public on technical science issues and natural resource issues in this state. Again, if we need to get the information, for example, we need to get California-specific natural resource information into all of our education programs that teach science. So people can know that, for example, food is not just grown in Texas, it's actually grown in California. Twice as much is grown in California. So we need the local people in our state to understand that. And the last is, we wrestle with this, and this is probably the most controversial thing, is we really need to step up the facility, the capacity, the support for planning. Because really, there's probably nothing more controversial than managing natural resources, water, land, wildlife. I can't think of anything more controversial than those kinds of things to manage. They're personal, they're powerful, they involve private land, public land, and the way you wrestle with those issues is you have to have the capacity and the resources to do the labor-intensive work of planning and sitting down with people and walking through the issues. So my last major point category is, well, who's going to do this? So look to your left, look to your right. You're going to do it. So you have been doing it. The folks in this room, you're all leaders on this. That's why you're here. And we just need to get thousands and thousands of more people doing what you do. I mentioned groups in this room, and there's many other groups in this room. Many of you, everything I described of what needs to be done, you're engaged in. Many of you are engaged in youth education. Many of you are engaged in building community capacity to wrestle with issues. We just have to do a lot more of that. We have to develop local organizations in the political and cultural and social structure locally so people can wrestle with these problems rather than just scream at each other. We have to do that to counter what we see in the media, which is completely, basically, trying to split people in polar opposite sides. You keep us opposite. If you listen to the radio, it's one station on one extreme versus another. Basically just going on people's fear. And the counter to that is the hands-on work of community groups, day in and day out, actually seeing people face-to-face in small gatherings, at a church, at a community organization, and having that conversation. And that's what many of you do. We have to, again, in that effort, reach across the political spectrum. And I think people, when you do that, if you haven't done it for a while, you actually realize how much we all have in common and around natural resource issues. For example, I think, frankly, in the Sierra, when I did the state wildlife plan, I directed it, and we did all regions of the state. Since I was the director of it, I got to cherry pick which part I focused on. And I cherry-picked the Sierra Nevada and the Southern Cascade, the Modoc, and the Mojave. But in the Sierra, in all these three areas, and in the rest of the areas, the one thing we found out when you went around and interviewed 40 to 50 experts or various stakeholders in a region, it was really surprising how much they all agreed what the problems were. I mean, I'm not kidding. across the entire state, you talk to people, they will almost all routinely say almost the same issues. Now, they might have a little bit different issue what you should do about it, but they pretty much all agree what the problems are. And that's not true in a lot of issues. In fact, the toughest situation was when you go into a room and no one even agrees on the facts, but, or that there is a problem. But for the most part, you sit down with people and they pretty much understand what change has gone on and what the issues are. Again, what you're doing and what we need to get more of is educating our youth and adults, but educating our youth. But frankly, that's what it will be in their soul as they grow older. If they've been outdoors and they see it, they feel it, it'll be something they want to act on. And again, come to conducting more efforts that share the science and share the knowledge. Very often, when there is a difference, it's because actually people don't have a shared understanding of the facts or the shared understanding of the science. So again, more of what many of you do. We need to encourage other groups to do more of it. And then again, to embrace planning. It's a very time-consuming effort, but that planning is what is the venue by which you finally lead to very important land use decisions, which actually affect natural resources. What is going to give resilience in the future to our resources? I was thinking about this initially, and I started thinking all the physical and environmental factors of the Sierra. Really what resilience is do we have the institutions in place to sit down and talk through the problems and the issues and address them? We don't even know what all the problems are going to be in the next 100 years. But if we have the capacity to sit down with everybody in the community and really work it through, gain a full understanding of the issue, we can solve the issues going forward. And you are seizing change. Like climate, we've made dramatic changes in climate change, it was just pointed out. And that same thing can apply to just about every other problem we're looking at, is basically the resiliency will become from what you guys do and what other groups do, and we need more of, is that basically bringing folks together and solving problems, and that will give resiliency to respond just about any problem in the future. Thank you.